In the previous video, we looked at how to use arrays of primitive data types. As mentioned in the previous video, arrays can also contain objects. This is highly valuable as an object can store multiple variables and methods to manipulate these variables. In order to get a good understanding of how useful having an array of objects can be, let's look at an example. Here is the example we looked at in the previous video. Looking at the int array that was created to store values that represent grades, the array could be used in a couple of basic ways. One way would be to store all grades for one student. Another would be to store multiple students' grades but only for one assignment. What if we wanted to store multiple student grades for multiple assignments? We can do that using an array of student objects, and that is what we will do in this video. Let's open up an empty project. We'll begin by creating a student class from which we can create student objects. These will be the objects we store in an array. The student class will not be the entry point for our program, so we will not include the main method stub. We are going to need a few variables in the student class. The first one will be a string variable that will be used to store a student's name. This variable will be called name. The next variable will be an array of integers used to store the student's grades. For now, we will only allow for 3 grades to be assigned to each student object we create. So we will call this int array variable grades, and we will initialize it to a size of 3. Next, we'll create a scanner object variable called input that we will use to accept input from the console. And finally, we will create an int variable called numGrades. This last variable will be used to keep track of how many grades have been assigned to each individual student object. If this last variable confuses you, don't worry, it will all make sense soon. Alright, now we will create the methods that we will use to interact with the objects we create from this student class. The first will be the constructor for the student class. If you remember, the constructor is used to initialize the object. For this constructor, we will add a string variable called name to the parameter list. And within the method, we will assign the string that is used when a student object is initialized to the object's name variable. Notice we are using the reserved word this here. We only use this here because we assign the string variable in the parameter list the same name as the string variable of the student class used to store the student's name. If we change the variable name in the parameter list, then we would not have to use the this keyword. For instance, we can add a 1 to the end of the name in the parameter list as well as here, and the method would have the same exact functionality. It doesn't matter what name you give to the variable in the parameter list. However, it is common that you will see the variable in the parameter list having the same name as the variable within the method that is being assigned a value by the method. And when this decision is made, the keyword this has to be used so that the program knows which variable is which. This is always used to refer to the object variable. Whether you decide to give the variable in the parameter list the same name as the object variable is up to you. Just be consistent. I'm going to go ahead and utilize the this keyword in this example. That will be all we will do for the constructor of this student class. Next, we're going to add getter and setter methods for the string variable name, as well as for the integer array grades. So for the string variable name, we will create a method called getName. And since this is a getter method, it will return the value stored in name, which will be a string, so the return type of this method will be string. It will require no parameters, and the contents of this method will simply be a return statement that returns the variable name. Next, we will create the setter method for the name variable. It will be called setName. This method will not return anything since it will be used only to set a new value to the name variable, so it will have a return type of void. This method will require parameters, as setter methods usually do, and that parameter will be a string variable, which would be the new name you would want to assign to the name variable. The contents of this method will be the same as the contents of the constructor, as it will essentially perform the same function. The difference between this method and the constructor is the constructor is used to give the name variable an initial value, whereas this setName method allows us to change the value of the name variable of a student object anytime after a student object has already been created from the student class. Now we will create the getter method for the integer array grades. Now this method will be slightly more complex since we first have to pull the values stored within the array into a string variable, which we will use in the return statement. So since we will be returning a string, the return type of this getGrades method will be string, and like the getName method, it will have no parameter list. Now the first thing we will do inside the getGrades method is initialize a string variable to store the values within the int array grades. We will call this variable student grades, and we will use a for loop to iterate through each index of the interarray grades, as well as the addition assignment operator to append each index to the string array student grades. And finally, we will return the string variable student grades. That will complete the getGrades method. Next, we will create the setGrade method. Once again, this setter method will not return anything, so we'll have a return type of void, and it will have a parameter list, which will be an int variable we will call grade. The contents of the setGrade method will be an if-else statement. We will check if the value stored in numGrades is equal to the length of the interarray grades. If the values equal each other, no more grades will be added to the array, and we will prompt the user, maximum amount of grades have been inputted, last grade not added. If the values are not equal, that means there is still space in the grades array, so the value passed in the parameter list will be added to the array. And after that, the numGrades variable will be incremented by 1, keeping track of exactly how many grades are within the interarray grades. This will complete the setGrade method. The last method the student class will have will be a toString method. Remember that toString methods are used to return the contents of an object in the form of string. So as always, the toString method will have a return type of string, and it will not have a parameter list. And the contents of the toString method will be a return statement which returns a string that will contain the name of the student as well as their logged grades. That will conclude the student class as well as this video. In the next video, we will create another class which will contain the main method, the entry point for the program. The object array will be created in the main method, which will be an array of student objects. As an exercise, I challenge you to write the main method that initializes an array of student objects. The array will hold a total of 5 students. First, prompt the user to enter the names of all 5 students. Then, display a menu that will allow the user to choose which student they would like to add a grade for. Once the user chooses a student, prompt the user to enter a grade for the selected student. After the grade is inputted, the menu is displayed again. Add a terminating value to the menu that when inputted will display all students as well as all grades for each student. The solution to this exercise will be explained in the next video of this tutorial series.